I'm pleased to invite Theresa McClenaghan, Executive Director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Please welcome her.
Okay, how's that sound? Now, which way's upside right?
That's right, and press backwards to go forward.
Okay, and first I need my slides up. There we go. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And in the interest of time, we'll just jump right in. So the Canadian Environmental Law Association is an environmental legal aid clinic and a Canadian NGO. We focus on access to environmental justice and pollution prevention and public health and safety. So today I'm going to talk about some of the implications from an environmental justice framework and a little bit about what it means to be a willing host and who has a role in decision making. And given the discussion that was just happening toward the end of Brené's presentation, one of the things that I would agree about, and I'll say right up front, is that it's very questionable environmental justice to put so much burden on so few people, because I'm going to be encouraging you to participate. You heard a sign a moment ago about how important it is to vote right now, but that's not the end of it, as you will see. There are many, many decision makers down the road, and it would be critical for the public to stay involved in those decisions. So through my presentation, I'm thinking, who are the right, quote, affected public and the right decision makers? My opinion would be that the affected public is much, much broader than this community, or much, much broader than the community between Ignis and Dryden. But that's not the way the process was designed, as you've heard. You can complain about that. This project is not built yet. All that's happened so far is decades of process. If political actors, like politicians, made a different decision, we could have a different process. Nothing is cast in stone. But some of the questions are the people being consulted the ones who would be most impacted? Brené's talked about transportation routes, for example, not being consulted. Are Indigenous and treaty rights being respected? Are all of the affected communities being consulted? And what's the geographic definition of the impacted community? And who's making the decision on behalf of the community? Who has that authority? So a few things about roles. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, you've heard already about them. Just to say, it's an industry-run organization established under federal legislation designed to give this decision-making authority to the industry. In terms of subsequent decisions, there is a regulator, the Nuclear Safety Commission, which will have some licensing decisions, and then under recent changes to environmental assessment law, there's also an impact assessment agency. And we don't have time today, but what I would say about the Nuclear Safety Commission is that I don't consider that decision maker to be adequately independent from the industry that it regulates. In 2016, there was a federal process before we got the new Impact Assessment Act that asked the question of Canadians about what we should have instead, and specifically in respect of nuclear decision-making, nuclear and energy, so they were talking about Nuclear Safety Commission and the National Energy Board. They talked about the high importance of trust and confidence in those decision makers. And so I've got a little quote there. What they were concerned about, because of what they heard about from the public, is that when the authority who has regulatory functions is also making decisions on behalf of the industry, then you have high levels of mistrust. I'm going to switch gears here to uncertainty, and you've heard quite a bit about this from Brené and other speakers, Gordon and Dale, but just to sum up from a big picture perspective, these are areas of uncertainty that have been true, like Renee said, back to the 70s, and certainly true in the whole time that this particular siting process has been underway. And these have not been solved yet, but they're perfectly valid questions for you to continue to pose. So how will the fuel properties itself change over these incredible timeframes? NWMO itself says that the fuel will not reach background uranium levels, and you already heard there are still concerns at those levels, but it won't reach those levels for 1 million years. What will happen to geology over that time frame? Think about the time frame for glaciation. In the land acknowledgement, we heard about glaciers retreating 10,000 years ago. Cataclysmic events, both accident and climate change induced and otherwise. And do we know of any human technology that can last that kind of time? Monitoring, we just had a great discussion on, but there are other intractable issues. Intractable means we can't really figure out an answer, like communication issues. And I've mentioned this a few times when I've spoken about this topic. The NWMO included a paper way earlier in their process where they brought forward some of the work of the philosophers discussing the idea of, quote, the long now. And they've posed this thought question, which is, can we think of any way to communicate to the future in a way that will survive? Has that ever happened before? We also have huge uncertainty about the type of waste, and those of you, I see many in the room who were involved in the low and intermediate waste siting facility that did not proceed, but you might remember on the first day of that hearing, several years ago, it was admitted by the proponent that the type of waste that would be emplaced in that facility had changed. So will that happen here? Will there also be other types of waste, low and intermediate? And of course, we already know, which was denied at the beginning of the NWMO process, it won't just be can-do waste. There'll be all kinds of different properties, meaning it's different types of radioactive substances, it's different times of decay, it's different heat, it's different forms of waste. Physically, it's all kinds of issues. And then because of our free trade agreements, there's uncertainty about whether it could even be limited to Canadian fuel waste as well. So what are some of the remaining ethical and moral issues to grapple with as you decide, how you feel about this project? We've heard discussion already about continuing to produce this waste that's so toxic. And let me take a step backward. In Gordon's slide at the very beginning, there was this kind of complicated diagram about the whole process of a nuclear energy plant. But it's just to boil water to produce steam so that you can turn a turbine to get electricity. That is what this is all about. And we're incurring this kind of level and length of time of hazard for the instantaneous electricity you and I are experiencing today that those future generations will never, ever benefit from when we have lots of ways we can produce electricity. Liability, accountability for accidents. I have a big concern about economic arguments, really forcing communities into making these decisions because they've been told there's no other economic future for them. I don't know if that's as true here. But that has been true for many of the 22 communities that the NWMO consulted over time, which in itself is a big ethical problem. So willing host concept, I'm just about out of time, but the NWMO has a principle that the community needs to be willing. It says it must have an understanding of the project and how likely it is to be impacted and must demonstrate that it's willing. That's their words, and yet we've heard quite a few points from the other speakers and myself about how many questions remain. There are lots of ethical frameworks about how to think about willingness, but I'll talk about a little bit of research. There's been very little research done on this academically. I had a student do research on this question a few years ago. when you, as non-experts, are quite rightly being asked about this project, how do you understand the justice and the ethical issues at hand, and how do you understand your role vis-a-vis the rest of the country, the rest of the nuclear plants, the operating plants into the future, if your decision is going to mean there is or isn't a nuclear waste facility in the future? And some of the questions that arise from those who write papers on this and who sometimes do expert reports for CELA's clients at hearings are things like, will there be stigma? What will it do to the reputation of your community on agricultural products, on tourism? On the other hand, is there more favorability because the phrase was nuclear oasis or nuclear culture, a community that's used to having operating nuclear plants and therefore doesn't really think about the hazard in the same way as it might have without those facilities? Are there disproportionate impacts on certain communities? Is there coercion? Should there be compensation for living next to a radioactive waste site? And if so, what is the rationale for that? And is there social acceptance? What's the community's perspective of that? So I'll finish with a few slides on how important it is to participate. Environmental justice includes fundamentally a right to participate. And this is something we're constantly fighting for in environmental law in Canada. It comes along and then it starts to be pulled backward and we have to fight for it again. Even this process, with all the ways it's changed over the last decade and a half, is an example of that. Similarly, right to know and the non-transparency that really infuses all kinds of hazardous sectors in this country. But why participate? Well, it enhances the democratic legitimacy of decision-making. We had a comment a few minutes ago about accountability. I agree there's very poor accountability right now. That is a really important question. The local community can communicate its values, its concerns, and local knowledge through participation, and it leads to better outcomes one way or the other. So, just to sum up what I've been saying, how do you define the affected public? Are the people being consulted the ones who would be most impacted? Are Indigenous and treaty rights being respected? Is everybody being consulted? Who's benefiting and who's bearing the cost? And who's making the decision? Which community? So that's it.
Thank you, Theresa. I've got a couple questions here. One is willing participation. What is the percentage of the population voting that needs to be in favor of this proceeding? I think this is actually kind of the willing host question. How many have to vote the binding? Are you able to answer that?
I don't know if I can, because I don't know if it's been spelled out in the host agreement or not, which Brene might be able to answer.
Maybe I can help then. I think it's 50, for it to be a binding decision, 50% plus one need to vote. And then whatever the majority is of that decision is binding. If it's less than 50% plus one vote, whatever the result of the voting is, it's not binding. And then the South Bruce Council has indicated they'll make a decision in the absence of that.
And as a generalization, the NWMO, through the whole process, has never defined its perception of adequate process and has left that very amorphous.
Another question here, I'm wondering if you can answer this too, Theresa. Is anyone looking into a use for the waste, considering that the energy level remaining in the fuel rods, et cetera? So,
who spoke about this earlier? Gordon maybe did? Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of work on nuclear waste policy in Canada over the last several years. All of us on this panel have been part of that. And we have asked the government to ban reprocessing nuclear waste, used nuclear fuel. Unfortunately, the nuclear waste policy did not explicitly ban doing so, but our reason for saying so is because of concerns over non-proliferation. The minute you start making the plutonium more accessible, it's more available to terrorism and weapons direction, regardless of the intent of the original body that did the reprocessing. And Dr. Ramana, who many of you might know, who just wrote a great book, just published, called Nuclear is Not the Answer, has a really, really, really good discussion about the linkage between weapons and power.
Thank you, Theresa.